want to say good morning. As I was roaming around between services, it got kind of late. I said, I got to put my robe on. Somebody says, oh, you don't have to have your robe. I says, oh, yes, I do. I can remember churches when I always put my robe on in the summertime, July and August. He always says, isn't that hot under the robe? I says, no, I'm probably the coolest person in because you don't know what I have underneath. So, with that, a message. In October of 2015, Reader's Digest carried an article that featured 24 stories about the editor called The Touching Kindness of Strangers. One story was titled, A Man at a Market. It was contributed by Leslie Wagner from Peel, Arkansas. Ms. Wagner told of being in a supermarket one time. When she checked out, the clerk tallied up her groceries. Much to Mrs. Wagner's surprise, she discovered that her bill was $12 over what she had in her purse. Well, with embarrassment, she began to remove items from the bag in her cart. Quite to her surprise, another shopper saw her predicament and handed her a $20 bill. Well, embarrassed, Ms. Wagner said that the person was making a very generous offer. So please don't put yourself out. Well, let me tell you a story the kind person said. My mother is in the hospital with cancer. I visit her every day and bring her flowers. I went this morning and she got mad at me for spending my money on more flowers. She demanded that I do something else with that money. So here, please accept this. It's my mother's flowers. And so gratefully, she did accept the gift. You know, what really a very thoughtful act. We are always touched when we see one person do something kind for someone else. It gives both the giver and the recipient good feelings. In fact, it's a wonder why more of us really don't perform numerous acts of kindness for another, just so we can experience a good feeling. Of course, one of the world's best known acts of kindness is found in our gospel lesson for the day. It's a familiar story to us all. It's a story that Jesus told about a man who was going from Jerusalem down to Jericho when he fell among thieves who robbed him, stripped him, and beat him and left him for dead. But scholar William Barclay notes that this kind of thing frequently happened on the road from Jericho, or Jerusalem to Jericho, Jericho to Jerusalem. The road was notoriously dangerous for travelers of the day. And just for a side note, years ago I took a course study in which I traveled that road all the way from Jerusalem to Jericho. And I have many interesting stories about that adventure, but I don't have time for it right now. It would take an hour, or at least an hour to do that. But Jerusalem is set on a hill that is 2,300 feet above sea level. The Dead Sea, which is located near Jericho, is 1,300 feet below sea level. So the road between Jerusalem and Jericho descends about 3,600 feet and a little more than 20 miles. It is a road with sharp turns and narrow passageways that provides several excellent lurking places for thieves and bandits. Fortunately, the road was well traveled at this time, so it wasn't long until a priest happened by. Well, unfortunately, The priest glimpsed at the broken and bleeding body lying there beside the road and hurried by on the other side. Now, let's assume he thought the man was dead. The priests were forbidden by liturgical law from touching a dead body. Dead bodies were ceremonially unclean. Likewise, a Levite, when he saw the man, passed by the other side. Levites were under the same prohibition concerning dead bodies as the priests were. But there was a certain Samaritan, and that's all we know about it. He was a Samaritan. A certain Samaritan who was coming upon the man had compassion on him. He went to him, bound up his wounds, pouring oil and wine on them, and he placed the beaten man on his animal and took him to an inn to take care of him. Now, it's thought that this inn was about halfway between Jerusalem and Jericho. It was the only stop in the desert to get food, water, or rest from the journey. Now, as I didn't say this, but that's 20 miles from Jerusalem to Jericho, the terrain was completely desert. Well, the next day, when the Samaritan needed to be moving on, he went to the innkeeper, took money out of his own pocket, and gave it to the innkeeper, saying, "Take care of this man, and if it isn't enough, I will give you more when I return." You know, the story of this Good Samaritan is one of the most famous stories in all of literature. And Jesus told this story to the lawyer's question, "Who is my neighbor?" Now that is a question that still haunts us today, doesn't it? Who is my neighbor? Question. Are illegal immigrants our neighbors? Last Sunday, Independence Sunday, I gave a sermon at a church that tried to answer this question as to what the Christian response should be to the immigrant. One answer I gave was quoting from the phrase that's on the Statue of Liberty. "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to be free, the wretched refuge of your teeming shore. Send the homeless, tempest, tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." Another quote was, "One nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all." Are people who are starving in remote sections of our earth our neighbors? That's interesting. It's interesting. Luke tells us that the lawyer asking this question did so seeking to justify himself. You know, we ask the same thing, also trying to justify ourselves. As followers of Jesus, we know that the obvious answer to this question, anybody who needs help, is our neighbor. And friends, that is a lot of people. Jamie Taylor, the 17th century bishop, used to counsel aspiring ministers to, quote, "Speak kindly to everyone you meet, for everyone has a problem." Everyone does have a problem of some kind. Everyone does. I guess that makes everyone our neighbor. I doubt that there is anyone here this morning who does not feel a twinge of guilt when reading this story. We recall the hitchhiker we left standing by the side of the road. We know the danger of picking strangers up, and yet it still bothers us when we just pass someone by. There is that dialect who approaches us on the street asking for a handout. "Oh, he'll probably spend it on whiskey," we say to ourselves as we pass him by. But deep in our hearts we wonder, what would Jesus have done? Lord, what is my responsibility to these people? We quietly pray. There's so much need everywhere I turn. How far do you mean for me to go? While you ponder that question, let's confront the fact that our society today, people are less and less likely to play the role of the Good Samaritan. On the front page of a newspaper, there was a picture that was very sad. A man who was a Vietnam veteran, had been a paramedic in Vietnam. He was leaning on the door of an automobile that was stalled beside a busy expressway in some northeast region of our country. The story underneath explained the circumstances of why he was bent over in the car and was weeping. On the way to work that morning, the woman who had been driving that car had a heart attack and had fallen outside of the car there by a busy expressway. And this man happened along and stopped to render help. Well, being a paramedic, he gave her emergency treatment for some 20 to 30 minutes. He was able to keep her alive. But after 25, 30 minutes, she died in spite of all the emergency treatment he was able to give. But the reason for his crying was this. He said that during that period of 20 to 30 minutes, he beckoned everyone who passed along the roadside to stop and summon help for them, to get an ambulance to come to the rescue of this dying woman. But he said, no one seemed to care, and no one stopped. That's a revealing story of the kind of society we're becoming. Obviously, we have our reasons, just as the priest and the Levite had their reasons. Still, the story makes us uncomfortable. There are two levels in as which we may respond to the story of the Good Samaritan. The first is the level of simple chivalry and common courtesy. I read that just as Hawaiians have no word for weather because the climate is so good, Eskimos have no word for thank you because the world is so stark. Helping one another and neighbors seems to be as a duty. You think of being civil to one another is the least we can do. Every major religion, philosophy acknowledges that. Ask any of our college students who take philosophy or social sciences. You must certainly do not have to be a Christian to extend common courtesy or simple kindness to a stranger that's in need. Dr. Daniel Leroy tells about a professional football player named John Frank. And by the way, did one person receive a scholarship says he's plays for Mount Union? Ohio University, do you play Mount Union? No? Baldwin Wallace? No? Ohio State? No! Okay. But anyway, tells about a football player named John Frank who spent 5 years in the San Francisco 49ers several years ago. Frank had played in 2 Super Bowl games. He was 27 years old, and in his prime as an athlete was something happened to him in that prime that caused him to reassess his priorities. In one of the 49ers games, an opposing player appeared to have suffered a serious injury. John Frank rushed to his side. At one time, Frank had dreamed of becoming a physician, but he gave in to fame, glory, and big bucks of being a professional football player. But still, he had that physician's heart. And so, it was only natural when he saw this player injured that he would pause and try to help him. The result was that Frank was chewed out by his coach for giving aid and compassion to an enemy. Suddenly, life as an NFL player was not quite as important to Frank. At that moment, he decided to hang up his cleats. He decided to go full-time to medical school. And today, John Frank is a practicing physician. Walking away from pro football seems silly to everyone, but Frank says he is happier now in serving the hurting. He says he has no regrets about giving up fame and fortune in the pro ranks. You know, we admire a person like John Frank. And we need to recognize that the kindness of the Good Samaritan is sometimes being shown. It is sometimes being shown all over the world. Courtesy, compassion, and kindness are at the least of what we ought to be, that's expected of as a human being. However, the teachings of Jesus instruct us to go a little beyond what the ordinary person is apt to do. We need to know that there are people who go the extra mile, who care just a little bit more. In her book, Profiles in Character, former Congresswoman Barbara Cuban of Wyoming tells how her character was shaped by the moral influence of her parents. Barbara's parents divorced when she was young. A few years later, Barbara's mother remarried. Her stepfather worked hard to support the family. One particular story demonstrates the kind of person he was. Barbara's birth father, while visiting Wyoming, was beaten and robbed. Eventually, he was not in good condition and he was alone. At the hospital, a paramedic searched her father's clothes, found his ex-wife's phone number, in one of his pockets and called the house. Barbara's stepfather answered the phone. When he learned what happened, her stepfather dropped what he was doing, went immediately to the hospital and paid her birth father's hospital bill. Then he took her birth father to a local motel. The stepfather paid the proprietor of the motel for the father's room and meals until he had recovered enough to go home. Now, I really don't know how most second marriages are, but I'm not surprised that her stepfather's kind deed to her birth father made such a deep impression on Ms. Cuban. There are many good Samaritans of every race and creed all over the world. Those who follow Jesus, however, are expected to even more. We are expected to give love and compassion to those whom others pass by. To whom much is given, much is required. But there's one more important thing we need to see in this story. Those of us who have known the grace of Jesus Christ at work in our lives know that it was once we, you and me, who lay in a ditch, broken and bleeding. 47 years ago, I was one who was once in a ditch and bleeding. When Reverend Doug Lewis asked me to fill the pulpit for Reverend Oglesby last year, my heart jumped with elation. For it was this congregation's compassion and Christ's unmistakable love that had God pull me out of the gutter. It is the ultimate Good Samaritan who is God, who ministers to our needs. Now we long to do for others what God has done for us. That's what grace is all about. Our opening hymn this morning, we sang, God of grace, God of glory, on thy people pour thy power. That is what, my friends, is what the gospel is all about. There was a fashionable phrase a few decades ago known as compassion fatigue. That was the term used to describe those who during the 60s and 70s tried to right society's wrong, but were soon burned out. They suddenly lost their enthusiasm for doing good. They called it compassion fatigue. The reason they lost their enthusiasm for doing acts of compassion and kindness was clear. They started with the wrong motivation. They wanted to help and build a better world. And that's good, friends. That's good. But that is far better than being an insensitive clod and that lives only for him or herself. However, this world is so big and people's problems seem so complicated. Many of these well-intentioned people simply burn out. They run out of enthusiasm for helping people with their problems, and they throw up their hands and they walk away. Many of the people who remained in the battle to build a better world were there for a different reason. It was because they could see a man dying on the cross for their sins. And they realized that they owed a lifetime of service in response to the kind of love that was extended to them. I do not know of any great servant of humanity, whether it be Dr. Albert Schweitzer, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., or Mother Teresa, whoever it might be, who is not driven first of all by the love of God. Loving people is not enough. People can be ornery, sometimes hostile, even those who are in need of help the most. But if you are motivated only by the love for people, you will soon grow weary in well-doing. But if you're motivated by your love for God, you can move mountains. As we sang earlier, save us from weak resignation. Grant us courage, serving Thee, whom we adore. Archibald Rutledge once told about visiting a church service where the singing was contagious, the prayers were splendid, the minister most impressive. And as the congregation was leaving following this benediction, however, there was a woman, scruffy and weeping, sitting by the churchyard fence. And only one of the worshipers paid any attention to her, said Rutledge. One of the ladies went over and knelt down beside the desperate woman and sought to dry her tears and to comfort her. Rutledge concluded that only one person in the entire congregation really knew how to worship God. It was the one who was doing something to help. When Christ gets a hold of us, we reach out to other people, not because we are nice people. We do it because once upon a time, we were lying in the ditch, and a stranger reached out to us. Now a stranger has invaded our lives. And it is Christ, not we. It's Christ in us who reaches out to our neighbor through us, using our hands, our material resources, and our valuable time. And then the author paints a revealing picture. On the street, I saw a small girl, cold and shivering in a thin dress, with little hope and a decent meal. I became angry to God and said, Why do you permit this? Why don't you do something about it? For a while, God said nothing. That night, God replied, quite suddenly, I certainly did something about it. I made you. And that's why God made all of us. To do something about it. Can He depend on you? One of the things I do in all my services, I always have the congregation just stop, silent, for 1 minute. Let God enter your heart. You know, sometimes as we pray, we say, Dear God, thank you for this, thank you for that. Will you help this person? Will you help that person? Give me strength. Da-da-da. Goodbye. We hang up. I want us to give God a chance to tell us something. What we can do to share the love that He shared on that cross. Let us just pause for 1 minute. Sovereign God, whose judgments stretch beyond our thinking and challenge our doing, you have placed us in the midst of your eternal realm to be neighbors to sisters and brothers we have not yet acknowledged. Draw us into the circle of mutual caring, where the suffering of one is felt by all, and injustice is confronted at every level, to communicate your mercy to the world. Commission us through your word to grow, bear fruit, and to serve. Amen. And now let us join in